Inside a packed airplane, tension erupts when arrogance collides with innocence. A cruel outburst turns the cabin into a silent stage, and one small act shifts the balance of power. A stranger's presence lingers in the background, waiting for the moment to intervene. "We don't want your kind sitting here." The words cut through the hum of the airplane cabin like a slap of cold wind. The voice, sharp and dripping with contempt, belonged to a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his face flushed with the smug heat of self-importance. Passengers turned their heads, some curious, others shrinking into their seats, desperate not to be noticed. The plane was mid-boarding, overhead bins slamming, seatbelts clicking, but in row 14B, a storm brewed. A black boy, no older than 12, stood frozen in the narrow aisle. His wide eyes flickered between the angry man and the flight attendant who hesitated at the front, pretending not to see. The man sneered, gesturing wildly with his hand as though shooing away an insect. "Move, before I make you." His tone carried the unearned authority of someone who'd spent his life mistaking cruelty for strength. Gasps rippled. Mothers clutched their children closer. Businessmen looked away, pretending to read emails. No one spoke. Silence thickened the air, cowardice pressing against the walls of the cabin. The boy gripped his backpack straps tighter. His knuckles whitened, but his lips stayed shut. He had learned too young that silence was sometimes survival. His calm, unbothered presence only seemed to inflame the man further. And then it happened. A sharp, open-handed slap cracked across the boy's cheek. The sound was obscene in the small cabin, louder than the engines warming beneath the wings. The boy staggered, his backpack sliding to the floor with a thud. The symbolic action left the air buzzing. It wasn't just a slap. It was centuries of arrogance condensed into one violent gesture. The boy's cheek burned red, but his eyes did not water. He raised his chin slowly, deliberately, as if refusing to grant the man the victory of his tears. His lips parted, and, in a voice steady enough to chill bone, he said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The cabin froze. A single soda can rolled down the aisle, the hiss of carbonation the only sound. From the back of the plane, a figure stirred. A stranger. A man whose face was still hidden in shadow, yet whose presence suddenly commanded the room. He unbuckled his seatbelt and began to rise, each movement slow, deliberate, filled with quiet authority. The racist man shifted in his seat, suddenly less sure of himself. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and avoided eye contact, as though sensing that his arrogance had just summoned something he couldn't control. The stranger's shadow stretched across the aisle as he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the scene. Passengers leaned back, breath held, waiting to see what this man would do. And in that suspended moment, with the engines roaring beneath their feet and the air thick with unspoken fear, the story of the flight truly began. The man in the aisle, seat puffed his chest, trying to recover the dominance that had just slipped through his fingers. He rubbed his hand as though proud of what he'd done. The boy stood silent, his backpack at his feet, his cheek burning. Then, step by step, the stranger moved forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that swallowed the narrow aisle. He wore a dark jacket, simple but neat, his posture straight as a blade. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes burned with a focus that made people lean back instinctively as he passed. "Hey," the man in the aisle seat barked, sensing the shift. "Mind your business, this doesn't concern you." The stranger stopped at row 14. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried like thunder. "It concerns everyone when a child is assaulted." The cabin went silent again. No overhead. Bins slammed now. No whispers carried. Every passenger hung on the words, eyes flicking between the aggressor and the stranger. The racist man scoffed, forcing a laugh. "Assault? Don't exaggerate. Kids these days are soft. He was in my way. Someone had to teach him manners." The boy blinked hard but said nothing, his chin still lifted in silent defiance. The stranger crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eye. His voice softened. "You okay, son?" The boy nodded once, but his silence screamed louder than any words. Straightening, the stranger's gaze returned to the man who had struck him. "Apologize." The man barked another laugh. "Apologize? To him? You must be joking. I don't apologize to... He caught himself mid-sentence, but the sneer on his lips betrayed what he had almost said. Gasps rippled. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Another voice whispered, "This is going too far." The stranger took a single step closer, his shadow spilling over the seated man. "You will apologize," he repeated, voice even, almost gentle, but iron beneath the tone. The man shifted in his seat, suddenly restless. He reached for the call button above, slapping it with unnecessary force. The chime rang through the cabin. "Stewardess, over here," he barked, trying to reassert dominance. The flight attendant approached nervously, forcing a professional smile. "Sir, what seems to be the problem?" The man pointed an accusing finger at the stranger. "This man is threatening me. I demand he go back to his seat." But the flight attendant's eyes shifted between the boy, still clutching his cheek, and the stranger's steady stance. Her face tightened. She had seen what happened. So had everyone else. "I think," she said carefully, "the problem is something else." The man's face flushed. "Are you taking his side? Over me?" A voice rang out from the back. A woman, older, with silver hair. "We all saw what you did. You hit that child." Another passenger joined in. "It was unprovoked. Completely unacceptable." One by one, murmurs grew. The silent wall of indifference that had protected the man began to crumble. He darted his eyes around, realizing the crowd he once controlled with intimidation was turning. The stranger didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This is your last chance," he said firmly. "Make it right. Apologize to him." The boy's small frame stood tall beside the stranger now, almost shielded by his presence but glowing with a dignity of his own. The man gritted his teeth, his pride wrestling with fear. He glanced at the stranger again. And for the first time he saw not just a man but authority, not the kind worn with badges or uniforms, but the kind carved deep into bone. "I don't owe him," he started, but his words faltered. The stranger leaned closer, his voice low enough that only those near could hear, but firm enough to slice the air. "Every second you refuse, you lose more than your pride. Choose wisely." The cabin held its breath. Every pair of eyes was locked on him. The engines roared beneath them, but it was nothing compared to the roar of tension inside. The man swallowed hard, his jaw twitching. He opened his mouth, and then the plane jolted as it pushed back from the gate, the captain's voice breaking. In over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are cleared for departure. Please take your seats." The moment shattered, but the storm had not passed. It had only been delayed, because the stranger was not finished, and neither was the boy. The engines roared louder as the plane rolled onto the runway. Passengers buckled, in-flight attendants hurriedly securing carts, and the cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Yet row 14 remained the epicenter of a storm no altitude could escape. The boy sat now, backpack at his feet, his small hands gripping the armrests. His cheek still carried the red mark, but his eyes, though tired, refused to look away from the man beside him. It was a silent challenge, a refusal to shrink. The stranger had returned to his seat 2 rows behind, but his presence lingered like gravity. The passengers felt it. Their eyes flicked back toward him even when he sat still, as though he was the only steady anchor in a cabin of turbulence. The man in 14A, Mr. Garrison, as the flight manifest would later reveal, sat with his arms folded, tightly across his chest. He muttered under his breath insults too low for most to catch but sharp enough for the boy to hear. He wanted to reassert control, to remind everyone that his arrogance hadn't cracked. The plane tilted upward, climbing, into the night sky. The hum grew steadier, the city lights below shrinking into constellations. The boy inhaled slowly, almost trembling, but the stranger's earlier words echoed in his mind. "You okay, son?" The seatbelt sign chimed off. The aisle came alive again, with the shuffle of attendants and passengers adjusting trays. And still, every few seconds, eyes flicked toward row 14. Mr. Garrison leaned toward the boy suddenly. His voice was a venomous hiss. You think anyone cares about you? That man's just showing off. When he's done, you'll still be nothing. The boy stared at his knees, refusing to respond. But his hand trembled. Then before Garrison could lean back, a voice carried from 2 rows behind. Say another word to him. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The stranger's tone cut sharper than any yell. Every head turned again, as though the command itself carried weight. Mr. Garrison whipped his head around. What did you say? The stranger stood slowly, not rushed, not rattled. He walked the aisle again, calm as though turbulence didn't exist. Passengers leaned back instinctively, clearing space for him without being asked. I said, the stranger repeated. Say another word to him and you'll regret it. The boy's head lifted this time, his eyes meeting the stranger's. For the first time since boarding, there was something there besides endurance. A flicker of hope. Mr. Garrison smirked, though his jaw twitched. And what exactly are you going to do? Who are you to tell me anything? The stranger stopped at their row. He rested a hand lightly on the seat in front of him, his gaze steady. Who am I? He said softly, almost to himself. Then his eyes sharpened. I'm the one who doesn't look away. The words landed heavier than fists. A murmur spread through the passengers again. Some nodded, subtle but visible. A man in a business suit whispered to his wife. He's right. The flight attendant hovered a few rows away, uncertain but clearly leaning toward the stranger's side. Her training told her to de-escalate, but her conscience told her not to silence the truth. Mr. Garrison let out a bark of laughter, too loud, forced. Hero complex, huh? You don't scare me. The stranger leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only the front few rows could hear, but his eyes locked on Garrison's. Fear isn't my goal. Respect is. And right now, you've lost every ounce of it. The boy's breath caught. He felt the shift. The man who had slapped him, who had wielded power through cruelty, was shrinking. Not physically, but visibly. The arrogance that had seemed untouchable was cracking under the weight of dignity. Passengers were no longer silent statues. They were witnesses. And more than that, silent jurors. Their gazes formed a wall Garrison could not push through. The stranger straightened. He glanced down at the boy once more. You don't have to carry this alone, he said softly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. The boy nodded, his throat too tight to answer. Garrison spat out, desperate now. Who are you really? Some activist? A wannabe cop? You don't belong here any more than he does. The stranger tilted his head, considering. A faint, knowing smile tugged at his lips. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he returned to his seat slowly, deliberately. His silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Because what Garrison didn't know was this. The stranger's identity would change everything. The engines droned. The plane cut through clouds, steady at cruising altitude. Yet the cabin felt like it balanced on the edge of a knife. And with every mile, the stranger's quiet power grew, while Mr. Garrison's world began, slowly, inevitably, to collapse. The plane jolted suddenly, trays rattling and overhead bins shivering with metallic clinks. Gasps filled the air as passengers grabbed armrests. The fastened seatbelt sign flickered back on with a sharp ding. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice rang steady but clipped through the intercom. We're passing through a patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. The aircraft shuddered again, a deep groan vibrating through its frame. The cabin lights dimmed. For a moment, all arguments were forgotten in the primal fear of falling from the sky. The boy pressed back into his seat, his small hand clutching the armrest so tightly. His nails dug into the plastic. His cheek still glowed faintly red, but now it was fear that filled his eyes. Mr. Garrison chuckled, though it was thin, brittle. Look at him shaking. Pathetic. His words came sharp, but they masked his own nervous glance at the window, where lightning flashed faintly in the distance. The stranger, however, sat still, his seatbelt locked, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He was a statue of composure, as though the shaking of the plane barely touched him. That composure spread. Passengers nearby found themselves stealing glances at him, drawing steadiness from his stillness. The boy looked back, eyes wide, and for the first time since boarding, his shoulders eased just a fraction. Another jolt. A few muffled cries. The plane leveled briefly, then rocked again. The stranger finally spoke, his voice carrying low but steady over the drone of engines. "Everyone stay calm. Planes are built for this." The tone, measured, confident, professional, snapped. Heads toward him. It wasn't the voice of an ordinary passenger. It carried training. Authority. Mr. Garrison snorted. "What are you now, a pilot?" The stranger's eyes slid toward him, cold and unblinking. "Close." That single word shifted the air again. Murmurs rippled. People exchanged looks. The boy's eyes lit with sudden curiosity. Who was this man? The turbulence worsened, the cabin shuddering like a toy tossed by invisible hands. Oxygen masks swayed threateningly above. But the stranger remained motionless, his gaze fixed ahead. "Sir, do you—" A nervous flight attendant began, her voice cracking. The stranger nodded once. "Calm. Stay buckled. They'll fly us through it. The worst will pass." And though he gave no badge, no title, no name, something about the way he said it calmed her instantly. She nodded, retreating down the aisle, reassured. Mr. Garrison's laugh was too sharp now, forced through clenched teeth. "Oh, so you're in charge now? You think one calm voice makes you important?" The stranger turned toward him slowly, his gaze level. "No. Integrity makes you important. Something you've forgotten." The words landed heavy. The passengers heard. Their eyes told the story. The tide of silent judgment was turning fully against Mr. Garrison. The boy stared at the stranger with wide, unblinking eyes. In the reflection of the window, lightning flashed again, illuminating his small face, beside the calm silhouette of the man who had stood for him. The turbulence rattled the plane again, then eased. The engines steadied. Slowly, the cabin's panic softened into cautious relief. The storm outside had begun to fade, but inside, the storm was only beginning. Because in those few tense minutes, the passengers had seen something they couldn't ignore. The stranger wasn't just someone stepping in. He carried authority, training, strength, and Mr. Garrison knew it. His smirk faltered. For the first time, he looked not arrogant but cornered. The boy whispered then, his first word since the slap. His voice was fragile but filled with awe. Who are you?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed forward, calm, but his lips curved in the faintest smile. "You'll see soon enough," he said softly. The engines hummed on, the sky beyond clearing. But the cabin knew. Something had shifted permanently, and the revelation of who this stranger really was drawing closer. The plane steadied, gliding smoothly now through calmer skies. The overhead lights glowed faintly, a soft yellow against the midnight blue beyond the windows. For most passengers, relief washed in waves. They'd survived the turbulence. But for row 14, the storm still raged. Mr. Garrison sat stiff, his jaw clenched, one hand drumming rapidly against the armrest. He kept his eyes locked on the seatback in front of him, avoiding the gazes that burned holes into him from every direction, because people were no longer silent. Whispers carried through the cabin like an underground current. "Who is he?" someone murmured, eyes flicking toward the stranger. "Did you hear the way he spoke? That wasn't normal." "I bet he's military," another voice replied. "The way he stood, too controlled." "No," a woman countered softly. I think he's law enforcement. Did you hear how calm he was?" The stranger sat quietly in his seat, hands folded, eyes closed as though he were meditating. He gave nothing away, no hint of irritation, no spark of pride. Just calm silence. And somehow that silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. The boy leaned slightly toward the aisle, trying to glimpse him. His young face carried both bruised hurt and an unspoken gratitude. For the first time since boarding, he wasn't entirely alone. A businessman across the aisle finally spoke louder, his voice cutting through the whispers. "I don't know who you are," he said to the stranger, "but thank you. That boy didn't deserve what happened." A few nods followed. A small wave of agreement. Mr. Garrison whipped his head around, his face red. "Oh, give me a break. You people don't know what you're talking about. That kid, he was blocking the aisle. Disrespectful." "Blocking the aisle?" a woman said sharply from behind him. "That justified hitting him in front of all of us?" The man faltered, sputtering. It wasn't like that. You're twisting it." "No." Another voice rang out, this time firm, a teacher-like tone. "We saw it, all of us. You hit him, and now you're trying to justify it." Mr. Garrison's face twisted, the walls closing in. The dominance he once commanded was slipping, replaced by the quiet but undeniable force of a united crowd. The boy looked around in wonder. For so long, he'd learned that silence usually followed cruelty. But now, silence was cracking. Voices were rising, not for him to defend himself, but to defend him. The stranger opened his eyes slowly, turning his head toward the growing argument. His voice, steady, cut through the noise. "Enough. He doesn't need a jury in the aisles." The cabin quieted instantly. All eyes on him again. The boy straightened, chest tightening as the stranger finally stood once more. His shadow stretched long under the dim cabin lights. He turned to Mr. Garrison, his gaze sharp but composed. "You think power is in volume?" the stranger said evenly. "But real power is in restraint. You showed the world your weakness when you struck him." The words landed heavy. A few passengers nodded subtly, the truth undeniable. Mr. Garrison barked a bitter laugh. "Big words. Still haven't told us who you are." "What, too scared to admit it?" The stranger's eyes narrowed. He leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough to pierce but controlled enough to avoid theatrics. "You'll know soon. And when you do, you'll wish you'd stayed quiet." A hush fell again. The boy's lips parted slightly. He wanted to ask again, "Who are you?" But something in the stranger's tone told him the answer would come when the time was right. Passengers leaned back, whispering once more. But this time, the whispers carried weight. Curiosity, respect, even fear. Mr. Garrison turned away, his face pale under the cabin light. His pride was cracking, and though he fought to hide it, everyone could see. The stranger returned calmly to his seat, folding his hands again. He closed his eyes once more, as though nothing had happened. But the boy kept watching him, his small chest rising and falling, his mind racing. For the first time that night, he believed something impossible. That justice, even here, even now, might be within reach. The cabin had shifted. What had begun as silent judgment had evolved into murmurs of solidarity. Eyes no longer flicked toward the stranger as if expecting miracles. They were now seeking reassurance that injustice could be challenged. Mr. Garrison sat stiffly, his posture defensive. He had never felt this small, this exposed. The boy's silent dignity, amplified by the stranger's presence, had made him visible to everyone. And now every pair of eyes was assessing his failure. A woman 2 rows ahead leaned slightly forward, voice low but pointed. "You need to apologize. That child didn't deserve what you did," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I've done nothing wrong. He disrespected me." "He disrespected no one," another voice chimed in. "You hit him for being in the aisle. That's not authority. That's cowardice." The murmurs swelled into a chorus. It wasn't loud, but the weight of collective observation was unmistakable. Every word acted like invisible chains, binding Garrison tighter in social exposure. The stranger remained seated, his hands resting calmly, eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, the room seemed to still. His presence alone commanded attention. "You're feeling cornered, aren't you?" he said, voice low. carrying an unmistakable calm that contrasted sharply with Garrison's twitching tension. All these eyes on you, judging your actions. You thought you could intimidate a child and hide behind authority. Look where that has brought you. The boy straightened slightly, emboldened by the stranger's words. He had never heard anyone speak like that to an adult who wielded power through fear. His chest swelled with the tentative warmth of hope. Garrison's face flushed. He attempted a weak laugh, forcing bravado. Who do you think you are? Just some guy on a plane. What could you possibly do? The stranger leaned forward, voice quiet but sharp. You've asked that question before, haven't you? To the people you've dismissed, ignored, or harmed. And now you're learning the answer. It isn't loud, it isn't flashy, but it is effective. Passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning closer, others whispering quietly. The dynamic had shifted completely. The silent power of dignity and presence outweighed any arrogance. Garrison had carried. The boy's gaze met the stranger's briefly. His lips parted just enough to whisper, "Who are you?" The stranger gave no immediate reply. Instead, he rose, standing slowly as though each inch of elevation was measured and deliberate. The cabin seemed to breathe around him. Garrison leaned back, trying to regain control. I don't know what game you're playing. You can't scare me into apologizing. A young man in row 17 leaned forward, voice firm. He already has in front of everyone. Look around. People aren't with you anymore. Garrison's eyes flicked nervously. The isolation had begun. The arrogance that had filled the aisle was now swallowed by whispers and judgment. The stranger's gaze didn't leave him. You've spent a lifetime believing intimidation and fear are power. Tonight you're learning something new. True authority? It comes from respect. And you, sir, have lost it. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others clutching their seatbacks, emboldened by the confrontation. The cabin had become a courtroom of silent jurors. The boy exhaled slowly, drawing a fraction of courage from the stranger's calm. He realized he wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't vulnerable. He could breathe without shrinking under Garrison's shadow. The stranger finally moved closer to the aisle, drawing attention with his quiet, controlled steps. And as for who I am, he said, voice deliberate, measured. You'll understand by the time we land. But until then, remember this. You are exposed. Everyone sees who you really are. Garrison swallowed, the words slicing deeper than any physical blow could. The arrogance that had once made him untouchable was crumbling under observation, judgment, and the subtle power of dignity. A woman in row 12 whispered, voice barely audible, I think he's someone important. Look at how everyone reacts. Another. Passenger nodded, a shiver of recognition in their eyes. Yes, trained, calm. He knows what he's doing. The boy felt a rush of quiet pride. He no longer felt like a victim. In the stranger's presence, injustice could be confronted. Courage could be borrowed, amplified, shared. Garrison's hands tightened on his armrests. He realized the flight had changed. The passengers were no longer an audience. They were witnesses. And he, the aggressor, had become the spectacle. The stranger's calm gaze swept across the cabin, pausing briefly on the boy. This isn't just about a slap, he said softly. It's about what people see when no one stands up. You've learned the hard way tonight that some lessons can't be ignored. The engines hummed steadily, the plane now gliding through the night sky with newfound calm. But in row 14, the tension had only grown sharper, because the stranger had begun to reveal a hint of his authority, and Garrison could feel it, deep in his chest. He had no escape. The cabin had settled into a tense quiet. Engines hummed, overhead, lights cast a soft glow, and passengers remained alert, their eyes flicking repeatedly between row 14 and the stranger 2 rows behind. Mr. Garrison had grown stiff, his arrogance fading into a thin veneer of defensiveness. He was fully aware now that he was not in control, that every whisper, every glance reminded him of his isolation. The stranger rose once more, moving slowly down the aisle, every step deliberate. He stopped at row 14, his shadow stretching across, the seats like a calm storm. Passengers held their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. "You've made a series of choices tonight," the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying evenly but firmly, "that have left you exposed in front of every witness on this flight." Garrison opened his mouth to interrupt, but no words came. His throat had tightened. He glanced nervously at the passengers, who now watched him like a man under trial. The stranger's hand rested briefly on the boy's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," he said softly to the child. "What happened to you is on him, not you." The boy swallowed, nodding once, his eyes wide. For the first time he felt protected, not just by the stranger, but by the collective acknowledgement of everyone around him. Garrison's hand twitched. He leaned forward, voice forced. "And who are you to—" "I'm someone who has seen people like you before," the stranger interrupted, cutting through the words like a knife. "People who believe intimidation is power and cruelty is control. You have a history of hurting those who cannot defend themselves, thinking no one will care. You've been wrong." Passengers murmured, some audibly, nodding in agreement. Whispers of approval, admiration, and quiet outrage rippled through the aisles. The stranger finally allowed himself a small smile. "I am law enforcement, federal, and my presence tonight isn't accidental." A collective murmur rose. Eyes widened, some hands clutched armrests. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, and Garrison's chest tightened with genuine fear for the first time that night. "You see," the stranger continued, voice calm, "my job is to protect those who cannot always protect themselves, and tonight that includes him." He gestured to the boy. "And everyone who witnesses justice being ignored." Garrison's hands shook slightly on the armrests. You can't. What are you going to do?" The stranger leaned closer, calm, measured, almost whispering. "I've already observed. Every action, every intimidation tactic, every lie you tell yourself to justify cruelty. And it will be documented. Your reputation, your career, your pride, all of it is at risk now." The boy felt a surge of quiet power. The man who had struck him, who had tried to dominate him, was shrinking under the weight of justice. Passengers began speaking up more openly. "You should apologize," a man said from row 17, firm and resolute. "Now." "You have no right to do that," another whispered, anger in his tone. The stranger's gaze swept across the cabin. "The truth is simple. Actions have consequences, and you've acted poorly, but it's not too late to acknowledge it." Garrison's face went pale, the red flush of arrogance replaced by fear. His breath quickened, and he tried to stand, but the collective attention pinned him down psychologically. "You hit a child," a woman said from row 12, in front of everyone. "Do you realize how that looks?" The stranger took a single step back, letting the words settle. "And now your audience is judged, but I will ensure that it reaches beyond this cabin. There will be accountability." Garrison's jaw clenched. He looked at the boy, then at the stranger. Every ounce of control he thought he had slipped through his fingers like sand. The stranger returned to his seat, the authority in his posture unmistakable. "Remember," he said quietly to the boy, "you are never too small to deserve protection, never too quiet to demand it, and never too powerless to change what happens around you." The boy exhaled slowly, chest swelling with courage he had never felt before. He glanced at the passengers, who now regarded him not as a victim but as someone worthy of defense, dignity, and respect. Garrison slumped slightly into his seat. The room had turned against him. His dominance was gone, replaced by whispers, murmurs, and judgment. The stranger's quiet presence remained, like an anchor in the storm. Passengers sensed that the real consequences had only just begun, and the truth of who this man really was and the power he wielded would continue to unravel Garrison completely. The cabin air hummed with tension. The engines droned steadily, but in row 14 a storm of a different sort had erupted. The boy sat upright, cheeks still faintly pink, but his eyes shone with a new light, courage quietly growing. Mr. Garrison's hands gripped the armrests so tightly that knuckles whitened. He had hoped the presence of the stranger would fade, that passengers would return to silence. But every glance, every whisper, reminded him he was exposed. The stranger rose from his seat, moving with deliberate calm. No one spoke, yet the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Each step he took toward row 14 resonated with authority. Not the loud, harsh authority of intimidation, but a quiet, undeniable power. "You've had your say," the stranger began, his voice carrying evenly but with a weight that could not be ignored. "But words alone cannot erase the harm you've done. Accountability requires acknowledgement." Garrison's lips tightened into a thin line. "Accountability? To a child?" "To everyone watching," the stranger said calmly. "To those who recognize wrong when they see it. You struck him in public. That is not authority. That is weakness." Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring approval, nods of agreement, whispered affirmations, even a faint clap here and there, all subtle but impossible to ignore. The social pressure was building, and Garrison felt it like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The boy's small voice rose, almost imperceptibly, at first. I didn't do anything wrong." The stranger's gaze met the boy's. "Exactly," he said softly. "You were doing nothing wrong, and for that you deserve protection and respect." Garrison barked a harsh laugh, trying to regain control. "This is ridiculous. I've flown thousands of miles, and now I'm being judged by a bunch of strangers?" "You've been judged," the stranger said, calm as a blade, "and the verdict is in. You've lost their respect. You've lost your moral standing. And the rest? Well, that will be handled appropriately." A woman in row 12 leaned forward, speaking directly to Garrison. "Apologize right now before this gets worse for you." Garrison's face flushed red with anger and panic. "I don't—" "Enough." The stranger's voice was firm now, carrying authority that could not be ignored. "Say the words. Acknowledge your actions. It's the only way to regain even a shred of dignity." The cabin was silent, every pair of eyes on him. Even those passengers who had been passive before now waited. The weight of collective observation pressed down, and Garrison faltered, struggling to find words. The boy's eyes shone with quiet hope. He sat taller, feeling for the first time that the power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer alone. The stranger's calm presence and the passenger's subtle support had created a shield around him. Garrison's jaw trembled. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The pressure was unbearable. Every glance from the stranger was like a spotlight, revealing every flaw, every lie, every shred of arrogance he had relied on for years. Finally, a whisper escaped, low and broken. I apologize." The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. Nods, whispers, subtle murmurs of approval. The boy felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a glimmering sense of justice. The stranger leaned closer to the boy. "See? Courage has a ripple effect. One act of standing up inspires others. Never forget that." Garrison slumped back in his seat, pale, defeated. His hands shook. The smug arrogance that had dominated the aisle was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of public humiliation. Passengers began sharing looks of quiet solidarity. The atmosphere had transformed. Where there had been tension, there was now a sense of triumph, soft, quiet, but undeniable. The boy's dignity was restored in the eyes of those around him. The stranger returned to his seat slowly, folding his hands. He didn't need to shout or demand further attention. His authority was inherent, quiet but absolute. The cabin had witnessed not only the collapse of arrogance but also the emergence of justice. The boy exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in hours he felt safe. He had been struck, belittled, and humiliated, but the balance had shifted. The power of dignity, presence, and collective observation had ensured that justice, however small, had been served. Garrison's gaze met the stranger's one last time. The unspoken truth was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. He had lost. More than respect tonight, he had lost control. And the boy? He had gained more than safety. He had gained belief. The cabin was silent again, but it was not the calm of compliance, it was the tension before a storm. Engines hummed steadily, lights casting a soft glow across rows of anxious faces. Every eye flicked toward row 14 where the boy sat small but resolute, and toward the stranger standing with quiet command. Mr. Garrison's shoulders hunched. He had spent years relying on intimidation, using fear to mask weakness. Tonight, that armor had shattered. Every passenger's gaze acted like a mirror reflecting his failings, and he hated the reflection. The stranger moved down the aisle deliberately. Each step was measured, calm, authoritative. The plane's movement seemed irrelevant in comparison to the weight he carried. "You've asked who I am," the stranger began, voice calm but resonant, echoing slightly in the cabin. "I've remained quiet, observing. But you need to understand the consequences of your actions, both here and beyond this flight." Mr. Garrison's eyes widened. "Consequences? What can you—" "I am a federal agent," the stranger interrupted, cutting through the words effortlessly. "Trained to observe, trained to intervene, trained to ensure that power is not abused. And tonight you have crossed a line." Gasps echoed softly. The passengers leaned forward, whispers, traveling like sparks. The boy's eyes widened in awe, feeling the weight of protection settle around him. "You hit a child," the stranger continued, voice unwavering. "And in doing so, you exposed your character to everyone on this plane. That exposure is not just social, it has consequences in the real world." Garrison opened his mouth, panic creeping into his voice. You can't," the stranger held up a hand. "I can, and I will. The evidence of your actions is clear, observed by every witness here. That boy's dignity is restored tonight, and your reckoning begins now." Passengers began speaking, up openly. "You need to apologize again. Properly this time," a woman from row 12 demanded, voice firm. "You can't just walk away from this," a man in row 17 added. "What you did is unacceptable." Garrison's face went pale. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by raw fear. The reality of exposure, social and legal, was crashing down. The boy's chest rose and fell. He had been small, vulnerable, and humiliated. But now he felt shielded by the collective witness of passengers and by the stranger's authority. The feeling was intoxicating. Courage surged through him, subtle but undeniable. The stranger lowered his voice, almost a whisper, but carrying to the nearest rows. "Mr. Garrison, every word, every action has been documented. Your arrogance is no longer invisible. You will be held accountable. And that starts with acknowledging the harm you caused." Garrison's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, closed, then whispered the words barely audible. "I apologize to the boy." A collective murmur of approval swept through the cabin. Heads nodded subtly. Some passengers exhaled relief. The balance had shifted completely. The stranger glanced down at the boy. "See what happens when someone stands with you? Witnesses amplify justice. You have power even when you feel powerless because people will respond to dignity." Garrison's hands shook as he pressed them into his lap. He was no longer in command of anything. His reputation, his pride, even the image he had carefully cultivated was crumbling. Every eye on the plane bore silent judgment. Every whisper reinforced his defeat. The stranger straightened, voice calm but resonant. I'm not here to punish beyond what is necessary, but understand this: power comes with responsibility. Misuse it and the consequences are unavoidable." The boy's lips curled into a small, victorious smile. His eyes sparkled with the rare thrill of justice restored. The passenger's acknowledgement reinforced the moment. Cruelty had been exposed. Arrogance had collapsed and dignity had prevailed. Garrison tried one last time to reclaim authority, voice faltering. This changes nothing. The stranger's gaze, sharp and unwavering, met his. It changes everything. From this moment forward, no act of intimidation, no slap, no abuse of power will go unnoticed. You have been made visible. And visibility carries consequences. Passengers now spoke freely, a chorus of quiet but undeniable judgment. "We saw what you did," a woman said, "and we will not forget it." The plane hummed steadily, cruising through the night. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within row 14 had reached its climax. Garrison's arrogance was shattered, the boy's courage had grown, and the stranger's presence had ensured that justice was not only witnessed, but actively reinforced. As the stranger returned to his seat, the cabin felt a profound shift. The balance of power had been realigned. The lesson was clear. Dignity and courage could overwhelm arrogance, even in a confined space like this. The boy exhaled, small and steady. For the first time that night, he felt the world tilt in his favor. Justice, long delayed, had arrived, not in violence but in presence, authority, and witness. The plane descended steadily, its engines humming a deep, consistent rhythm. Lights from the city below shimmered like a sea of stars. The cabin, though quieter than usual, carried a weight far heavier than altitude. Tension, anticipation, and the unspoken judgment of witnesses. Mr. Garrison slouched in his seat, hands trembling, eyes darting nervously from window to aisle to passengers. He had tried to maintain control, but every gaze had stripped him of arrogance, every whisper had exposed his cruelty. The sting of accountability pressed down like gravity. The boy sat upright, chest rising and falling steadily. For the first time, he felt the safety and validation that had eluded him for so long. The stranger's presence behind him had been a shield, a sword, and a guide. Courage, he realized, was contagious. Passengers leaned forward subtly, whispering among themselves. "Did you see that?" a woman said softly to her companion. "He's a federal agent, he didn't even have to raise his voice." "Quiet authority," her companion replied, "completely dismantled that man." Garrison's pale face betrayed every emotion he tried to mask: fear, shame, disbelief. He glanced around helplessly as the cabin collectively reinforced the stranger's silent verdict. His actions, witnessed and condemned, could not be erased. The stranger stood once more, calm and deliberate. He moved down the aisle, each step measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority that had gone unchallenged for years. "You have been observed," he said to Garrison, voice low but resonant, "and your behavior has been documented. The consequences of your choices extend beyond this cabin. Remember that." Garrison swallowed, unable to respond. He had faced arrogance before, but never the quiet power of presence backed by witnesses. The boy's dignity, passengers' silent support, and the stranger's authority had combined to create a force he could not counter. The flight attendant approached, her posture respectful yet firm. "Sir," she said to Garrison, "we've already noted your behavior. You will need to speak with authorities upon landing." A wave of murmurs echoed through the cabin. Passengers shifted, leaning subtly toward the boy, offering silent solidarity. The invisible wall of social accountability had never been stronger. The stranger returned to his seat, folding his hands calmly. He glanced briefly at the boy. "You've done nothing wrong," he said softly. "Remember, standing firm in truth changes the world around you. You're never too small to make it count." The boy's lips curled into a small, genuine smile. For the first time, he felt empowered. Fear had been replaced by quiet confidence, humiliation replaced by recognition of his own dignity. Garrison's attempts to reclaim composure faltered. He realized finally that arrogance could not shield him from consequence and cruelty could not obscure accountability. Every passenger, every witness, had seen the truth. And the truth had stripped him bare. The plane touched down smoothly, tires screeching slightly against the runway. The cabin remained tense until the hum of slowing engines filled the air. Passengers exhaled collectively, some leaning forward to retrieve belongings, others simply savoring the closure of the flight. Authorities were waiting discreetly at the gate, briefed on the situation. Garrison's face paled further as he realized the full weight of what awaited him. Legal, social, and professional repercussions were inevitable. The stranger gave the boy a reassuring nod. "This isn't the end," he said softly. "It's only the beginning of what standing up truly means. You've witnessed something powerful tonight. Never forget it." The boy's chest swelled with a quiet triumph. He had been struck, belittled, and humiliated, but justice had arrived. Not in violence, but in presence, authority, and witness. The lesson was clear. Dignity and courage could overcome arrogance and cruelty. Passengers filed out of the plane with a sense of shared understanding. They had witnessed a small revolution in that cabin, one that would remain with them indefinitely. Conversations sparked quietly, some amazed, some inspired, all aware that something extraordinary had transpired in a confined, ordinary space. Garrison, escorted discreetly by authorities, cast one last glance at the boy. There was no defiance left, only recognition of defeat and the unbearable weight of exposure. Every secret, every act of cruelty he had tried to hide, had been laid bare. The boy watched him leave, then turned to the stranger. "Thank you," he whispered, voice trembling but steady. The stranger smiled faintly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did all the hard work. You stood firm. I just made sure the world saw it." The boy exhaled, eyes glistening, a sense of justice and empowerment settling deep in his chest. As the plane emptied and night embraced the runway, the city lights reflected the subtle glow of victory. Cruelty had been exposed, arrogance had fallen, and dignity had triumphed. The story of that flight, a slap, a witness, a quiet revolution, would linger in the minds of everyone who had been there. And the boy, small but resilient, had learned that courage, when backed by presence and authority, could shift the balance of power entirely. The stranger's identity, now fully revealed, left a lasting impression on the passengers. Authority tempered with calm, justice executed with quiet strength, and the knowledge that standing up for what is right, even in small ways, can change everything. The boy smiled once more. He had survived the storm, both literal and metaphorical, and as he stepped into the night, he carried with him a newfound understanding of dignity, courage, and the undeniable power of justice witnessed.